What's up, guys? You excited? Are you guys ready? Today, my favorite thing ever, uh, vocab, but more specifically, vocab about geek stuff. And I can't imagine anything better. So let's dive right in. Okay, so this is a film class, but so far we've talked about the art and the history of it and all those kind of like big ideas about film, but let's get into some technicals as well. You have so many options for shooting film these days. You could be on, a camcorder style thing like this. You could shoot film on just a standard DSLR. This is probably the bulk of what we'll be shooting on. Might be on an action camera, such as this little Osmo Pocket. At the same time, you might be just shooting on your phone, and that's an option as well. So we have so many options for shooting film, but there's some technicalities, some technical details that apply to just about all of these, and that's really the purpose of this Filmmakers vocab. So let's go dive in and take a look at like exactly what these are, so we know what we're talking about. Okay, so the first thing that we should be talking about is aspect ratio. Aspect ratio is the shape of your image. So is your shape a little bit more on the square end, or is it a little bit more on the rectangular end, or aka widescreen? So aspect ratio, once again, that's the shape of your image. Generally speaking, most photos are still an aspect ratio of 4:3. When you type that in, it looks something like this, 4:3. So it's a little bit more on the square side. It's a little bit more rectangular. It's still a rectangular. It's not a perfect square, but it's pretty darn close to a square, right? Instagram, if you want to go back to the olden days, you can probably ask your parents about this. I'm old enough to remember when Instagram was first released. Every photo, they didn't even have videos on it yet back in the day. Every photo was a 1:1 ratio. Every photo was a perfect square. They've gotten a little bit, they've opened that up a little bit more in the recent years. But back in the day, it was an aspect ratio of 1:1. The world of film, that's all widescreen these days. So that's a 16:9 aspect ratio. So 16:9 aspect ratio. 99% of the time you want to be filming in landscape. Okay, you're going to learn the hard way. If you film like this on your phone, but then try and edit it so it looks like this on a computer, it's not going to end well. So 99.9% of the time, you want to be filming in landscape. Now, is there a time when it's acceptable to film in portrait? Yes. It's taken a lot for me to admit that. It's been many years, and I'm like, never film in portrait, but we're kind of getting to the point where, because we consume so much media on our phones, if you have something that you're like, I want people to only watch this on my phone, you can film in portrait. So if it's going on Instagram, or dare I say even something like TikTok or Snapchat, yeah, you can film in portrait, but if you film in portrait and want it to go on a computer or a TV, it's not going to end well. Okay, so long story short, 16:9, remember that. Okay, resolution. Aspect ratio and resolution are commonly confused. Certain resolutions have a specific aspect ratio, but resolution is the clarity or the pixelation, if you will, of your videos. So the vast majority of the world now shoots in 1920 by 1080. So that looks like this. 1920 by 1080. Sometimes you'll see people refer to this as 1080p. Okay, it's the same thing. 1080 is the height, 1920 is the width. That is a 16:9 aspect ratio, but that's the pixelation again. In the olden days, it was really common for like 360, 480, eventually 720 720 was like the HD of maybe 5 or 10 years ago, but now we've since moved on to 1080. In hot take, in my expert opinion, I would venture to say that 720 is no longer high def. You really ought to be shooting in 1080. You really ought to be exporting in 1080. And I'm looking at you, Wii Video. Let us export in 1080. Right now we're limited to 720, and it drives me insane. But I won't get too fired up about it right now. There are higher resolutions, so we're kind of getting out of the, pixelation size. We now just refer to these as like 4K, 6K, even 8K, and that's just the image quality is beyond incredible. It's insane. However, I don't think the world's ready for 4K yet. Your phone can shoot in 4K. Most DSLRs and action cameras can shoot in 4K these days. But 4K just takes up so much space. If you try and shoot in 4K on your phone, it's going to fill up immediately. The same thing with SD cards. Your computer is going to need extra processing power. Rendering a 4K video is going to take forever. And then by the time you get it onto YouTube, I don't know if it's really worth it right now. The world will get to 4K eventually, but for the time being, the camera technology is there, but all the other technologies need to catch up. All right, I'm long-winded about this. I'm sorry. Let's keep going. Frame rate, so frames per second. Okay, FPS means frames per second. It is still common to shoot in 24 frames a second. Hollywood is really still kind of in this realm of 24 FPS because it gives just the right amount of motion blur. If you shoot in a higher frame rate, the image is almost too crisp and it looks weird. The human eyes, for generations now, we've been trained for just a little bit of motion blur on the screen. So moving away from that, Hollywood hasn't quite done it yet. But most commonly, the vast majority of the rest of the world, the default on your camera and just about everything else is 30 frames per second. Instagram won't accept a frame rate under 30 frames per second. So if you want to be an artsy Hollywood person and get your stuff up on Instagram, you ain't going to do it if you're shooting in 24 frames a second. So that's kind of the industry standard for all the stuff that we would be making. Every once in a while, whether you're on your phone, DSLR, etc., action camera especially, you can jump up to 60 frames per second, and that's reserved for, you guys ready? This is a very official term. Buttery smooth cinematic slow motion footage. So if you ever watch a YouTube video or any kind of action camera video or anything like that, and they've got those like clips of really slow motion, just someone smiling or kind of that unscripted B-roll or something like that. You can't just take a 30 FPS shot and slow it down to get that slow-mo shot. You actually have to shoot in a higher frame rate. But that's something that we'll actually have a whole project dedicated to that. You must be very careful when mixing frame rates in Premiere Pro. You're going to run into all kinds of audio issues if you have one camera shooting in 30, one camera shooting in 60, and you try and mix those two audio samples, it's not going to work. So again, we're going to have a whole project dedicated to mixing these frame rates because it is more complicated than maybe it ought to be. All of the above settings apply to shooting on a cinema camera, a DSLR, a phone, an action camera. All these things can be adjusted. Maybe not so much the aspect ratio, but again, we often confuse those. So when you change your settings to a certain resolution, you'll be changing the aspect ratio as well. Although, I don't think any of us are going to go shooting 360 anytime soon. Okay, so now let's get into some stuff that's a little bit more DSLR or camcorder specific. Okay, not maybe your action camera as well, but I don't know if this is really going to apply to phones unless you have some kind of special app or something like that. So shutter speed, that shutter speed. Let's go back to photography. Shutter speed, aperture, and ISO all allow different amounts of light to come into the camera. Shutter speed, when you are taking still photos, you can adjust this all you want, but that's actually more or less locked when you're shooting on a DSLR. You want to set that to about double your frame rate. So if you're shooting in 30 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be about 60, etc. Do this to make sure your footage doesn't end up choppy. If you're adjusting the shutter speed, you're going to it's going to be kind of like a strobe light effect. So you want to be very careful with that. Aperture, this one functions pretty much just like photography. Although some camcorders will call this iris instead. So just be careful that if you happen to find yourself shooting on this and it says iris instead of aperture, that's what we're talking about. It's the same idea. That lower f-stops allow for more light, and that background blur called bokeh, something like that. Bokeh. I always mispronounce it. Leave me alone. Okay, ISO. Let's keep going. ISO adjusts the sensitivity to light. Lower ISOs can end up pretty dark, but you can always brighten it in post. Okay, I think one of the trappings of myself and all new filmmakers is that on these little LCD screens, when you're looking through this and it looks really dark here, your instinct is to brighten it so it's all bright and crisp on this. But by the time you get into a computer, it's going to end up washed out. So you got to be really careful. So anyway, if you set your ISO too high, you could potentially end up with a really grainy footage, really noisy footage. So be careful. Camcorders, again, if you find yourself on shooting on something like this, which I do, I think these things are great options. We don't need to be snooty DSLR filmmakers in here. Anyway, if you do find yourself shooting on one of these, it is not called ISO, it's called gain. Don't confuse it with gain that's related to audio, because that is an audio term as well. Both gain when you're talking about video and gain when we're talking about audio do actually have kind of the same effect. It's kind of the same principle, but let's not get carried away. So anyway, if you're looking for the answer here, gain, but don't confuse it with audio, because it is used the same. Okay, other things to consider. DSLR footage can be notoriously shaky. Please take steps to reduce that. Use a tripod, rest it on a table, lean against something. If you just run out and you start just pointing and shooting, you're going to be like, oh yeah, this is so smooth, I'm doing great. And by the time you get back into post-production, you're going to realize how bad it is. So be very careful. It's almost never recommended that you just shoot handheld on a DSLR. Beware of your white balance, okay? So if you're shooting outside, inside, under fluorescent lights, etc., make sure you're adjusting your white balance appropriately, because otherwise your footage is going to end up too cool, meaning like too many blues, or too warm and too many yellows. This happens way too much when we film in the gym, and everyone comes back with like yellow, dingy walls, and it's pretty bad, and it makes the gym look terrible, but then you realize that the gym doesn't look terrible. It's just the fact that we were all shooting in the wrong white balance. So pay attention to that. Okay, last thing, don't forget to format your SD card. You want to make sure that the camera and the SD card are talking together appropriately. So formatting an SD card is always a good idea, especially when we've got SD cards floating around the classroom. and everybody using them for different cameras, etc. But make sure that you've rescued all your content first, because when you format, it's going to erase everything on the SD card. So make sure that you upload your content first. You're warned. Alright guys, that is the basics of like filmmaking. This is all stuff that you might find boring, but without knowing this stuff, you're going to learn some painful lessons along the way, some of which I've had to learn myself. So, I hope this was moderately entertaining for you as much as it was for me, and B, if any of this goes horribly wrong in the future, don't say I didn't warn you. So, anyway, thanks for watching. Namaste.